The storms we chase are leading us, and love is all we'll ever trust. Yeah, no, I don't wanna waste what's left. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways, till my shadow turns to sun rays. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways, and on we'll go. Finding life along the way, melodies we haven't played. No, I don't want no rest. Echoing around these walls, fighting to create a song. I don't wanna miss a beat. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways, till my shadow turns to sun rays. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways, and on we'll go. And we'll grow in number, fueled by them to see the horizon, turn us to thousands. And we'll grow in number, fueled by them to see the horizon, turn us to thousands. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways, till my shadow turns to sun rays. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways, and on we'll go.
All right, hey everyone. I'm back, and we're on to stream number 2 of the DevNet Expert, or what I'm calling the road to DevNet Expert. So it's just something kind of catchy to keep us involved, and I figured the road to DevNet Expert was just kind of catchy. So yeah, so tonight, the last stream on Tuesday, we looked at Scrapply. We didn't really have time to look at Nornir, which is okay, since it's not on the lab exam. But I figured tonight that we could take a look at Ansible, and I'll start kind of square one and kind of move through examples, and then by the end, we'll add a couple tasks to a playbook, and hopefully kind of it wraps it all together. So yeah, so if you have any questions along the way, obviously the chat is open. I actually look forward. On Tuesday, we actually had a pretty good conversation. There were like 3 or 4 people that kind of kept the chat alive, and I think we had a really good conversation. So I look forward to it tonight as well. I know Ansible is like a hot topic for many, especially those starting out in network automation. It's something you hear about, but not necessarily, you're not sure where it fits. So I hope to kind of clarify that tonight, and then, like I said, dig into some examples. So, but let me start by going over kind of why we're looking at Ansible, right? So this is and I've showed this before on stream, the DevNet Expert equipment and software list. So this is something that, you know, this is basically what's going to be on the exam, right? In the lab environment, this is what you should expect to be installed on your workstation that you'll be using for the 8-hour exam, basically. So as you see here, man, I just had it. Oh, duh, it's right here. Ansible 2.9.26. So I installed Ansible 2.9. I didn't do .26, but since it's since this is more of like a minor release or patch fix release, like it's not like your major release and then your minor, and then I'm not too worried about maybe the small little tweaks here and there for the .26 release. So but we do have Ansible 2.9 that we'll be using tonight. I got it all set up before the stream. I ran some playbooks, made sure everything was kind of working. I learned my lesson from the last stream, which if you were here, you saw that I had an issue just connecting to the devices. So yes, but let me think, what else do we have? There was one other thing I wanted to show you on this page. I don't think so. If it comes back up, I'll come back to this page. But yeah, we'll be focused on Ansible 2.9, and obviously, I guess not obviously. There's multiple ways to install Ansible, and I'm actually using I use pip to install it, so I'm using Python. So I am actually running Python. I think I'm running Python 3.8.10. So I'm not actually running Python 3.9. So there is a little discrepancy there, but we'll kind of get through it. If you're watching and you notice any sort of hiccups in the stream today, please let me know. I've put this out on Twitter. I'm streaming exclusively with YouTube now because I was just having an issue streaming to both Twitch and YouTube at the same time. So, this is my first time not using that Restream software I was using before to kind of, push my stream out to 2 different platforms and communicate with both chats. So this is directly to YouTube. So if you notice any sort of hiccups with the stream quality, audio, video, whatever, just let me know. This is my first time, so just let me, give me a break. I'll try to fix any issues for the next stream. All right. So we went over the software list, and so I kind of just wanted to start out with some very basic concepts with Ansible. So it's been a while since I've actually looked at the documentation. I don't think, it's crazy, the last time I was looking at the documentation, I don't even think there was a Ansible for network automation area. I think if there was any, it was like a very basic, kind of like this basic concepts page, and that was it. But it looks like they've added some other stuff, like how is network automation different, running your first command and playbook, building your inventory. So this is actually some really good documentation right here. Hey James, stream is great so far. I appreciate it. Thank you for the feedback. It's definitely after my colossal failures in the past, I'm happy that this is working out so far. So, anyways, for those that don't know about Ansible, I'm not going to read through all the documentation because I do want to get to actual coding and the playbooks and running some practical examples. But essentially, think of Ansible is built on Python. So, those have been on these with me on these streams. I've only used Python, so you've definitely seen Python code. Ansible is an automation platform that's built on it. It will specifically be looking at Ansible for network automation, but know that Ansible is very popular outside of networking. So with servers, with even individual hosts. So there's plenty of other use cases for Ansible, but tonight we'll be looking at network automation. So some things to look at. So we have a control node, or what Ansible calls a control node. Think of this as like your central server. So Ansible is like a server client architecture. So think of your, like in my case, my computer is the control node. And then where we'll be like executing all the playbooks and scripts, everything off of the computer. Then we have our managed nodes. So the nice thing with Ansible is that it's considered agentless, and what that means is you don't actually have to have a piece of an agent is basically a little piece of software that is installed on your device, your endpoint, right? So think of it with like Windows. It has like what's called MDM software, so your device management software. Like think of that as kind of like an agent, right? So the nice thing is with Ansible is it's agentless. So you don't have to have anything installed, which is great for older network devices. I know newer network devices, you can install software on them. So that's, that isn't really like a limitation anymore, but we all have that 6500 switch out there that needs some love as well, especially with some automation. So there's older devices out there that can't support agents. So another kind of plus one, and why a lot of people start with Ansible when it comes to network automation. Your inventory, that's pretty self-explanatory. That's just your list of managed nodes. Modules, so we'll look at modules more practically here in a little bit. So modules is kind of where it's I don't want to really steal the words, but units of code Ansible executes. But think of it as like your tasks, right? So let's say you have a task that runs and collects show commands for a network device. Well, there's a specific module that just does that, right? And then there's another one that will specifically configure iOS devices or Cisco IOS devices. So, and then there's other modules for other vendors, Arista, Juniper. So these will, unless you're running all ad hoc command, you're definitely using a module when you use Ansible. Task and playbooks kind of go hand in hand. So playbook, think of playbook as like a Python script, right? It's your entire .py file, right? Your Python file. And think of task as like little functions within that file. So they're kind of smaller units. The tasks are smaller units, but they have one particular use, right? They have one particular, I hate using the word task for the definition, but really one particular task. And the playbook can be a group of tasks. And so that's kind of where the difference will be with these two. But like I said, I will go over all of these in a more practical example. I just wanted to start out with some basic definitions for everyone, just to, level set. I'm not going to make any assumptions about anyone's knowledge, and I don't mean to, talk down on anyone as well. This is kind of just starting fresh. So, all right, so those are the basic concepts. So one of the first things you want to do is build your inventory. There's actually a couple ways to do this. So you can actually build dynamic inventories from different sources. So if let's say you already have a central source of truth, they do have plugins that you can actually dynamically pull inventory. So you don't have to recreate an inventory file. But in our case, and what we're going to look at today, are the two kind of popular formats. And that's an INI file, which you see an example right here. And then down here, you'll see a YAML format. If you're very confused at the YAML format, just get used to it. We're going to dive into it. All I got to say is indentation is key. So as you see kind of all these different lines indented further and further in, it counts. So it's not just to look pretty. But the YAML format is very popular. Playbooks are built out this way. Inventory files can be built out using YAML. And ultimately, YAML is just a format that it's used everywhere. It's used in DevOps, used in NetDevOps, CI/CD pipelines. A lot of those like GitHub Actions, GitLab, all of their different CI pipelines, they use kind of a YAML format, a document that's in a YAML format. So we'll take a look at that. And like I said, there's a more basic version that's an INI file. We'll take a look at that as well, just because it's easier to look at and make more sense. And then we'll take a look at the YAML file. This just says there's always two default groups. There's an all group, which every device belongs to, and then an ungrouped that basically is, besides all, if you create groups, for example, let's say you have a group for routers and a group for switches, then let's say you have a firewall that you don't want to put in either of those groups, then it will be in the ungrouped category, which is default. And you can put hosts in multiple groups. Like I said, I'm not going to read through all the documentation. I just wanted to get everyone familiar with what we'll be talking about, so that way when we're actually in the files, it kind of makes sense. You can put variables in your inventory, which we'll take a look at. You could create aliases for your device, your host name, so you don't have to put like just the IP address and remember the IP. If you have like a favorite name or the host name, you can use alias, group variables, and it can go on and on. Like you can break out an inventory file. It could be huge, right? You could create groups on groups, nest the groups. It's pretty intense. And we'll take a very small example of that tonight. I created a simple inventory and then a more complex one. So anyways, so you have to build this first, the inventory file. And then, let's see here. And then this kind of gets into running your first Ansible command. So before we do that, let's just take a look at the code that we have. So I guess before everything, let me start off by saying Ansible has a default configuration file, which I believe, hold on. Sorry about that. Which I believe was mentioned in one of these. Yeah, right here. So they have a default location for the inventory, and it's in etc Ansible hosts, right? That's default for the inventory file. So this is if you installed your Ansible, if you installed Ansible on your system through like apt or some other package manager, like on Linux. But since I installed it using Python and with pip, by default it didn't have any sort of inventory or default location set out of the box, which is actually good because the defaults that come with Ansible, like the configuration file is like hundreds of lines long, and a lot of it's commented out. And it's well documented in that way because of all the comments, but at the same time, it's just so much. So as an alternative, and I always recommend, you should actually build out your Ansible configuration within your directory that your playbooks are in, or that your Ansible project is in, I should say, not just your playbooks. And you can, that will override the default. So whether you install it on your system or with pip, if you have a Ansible configuration file within your within the same directory, it can override the default location. Otherwise, you have to have, first off, I don't know like if you're putting this in a corporate environment, but you have to have permissions to even get it to this location, right, from your user profile. But like this location's not like traditionally super locked down, but there's always that could be the issue. So I always suggest build out a configuration file. That's one of the first things you should do. So you'll see here a bunch of green. So that's just my Git extension saying, hey, we have a bunch of untracked files. Because remember, this is the DevNet Expert, the GitHub repository. I'm just adding to it. So that way, after stream, you guys that are watching it on demand or that are just in the stream now, you guys can actually download this and play with it. So you see here, I created an Ansible folder under scripts. I probably could have built it, taken out of the scripts folder, but either way, create a new folder called Ansible. Within the Ansible folder, I have 4 files now. I have 2 inventory files. Like I said, I was going to create a simple one that's in an INI format and one that's a YAML format, a playbook, which we'll get into, and then the configuration. So the configuration, if you looked at the default configuration and looked at mine, you'd be like, why is yours only 4 lines long? Seriously, like that's because, like I said, they have so many commented out documentation within the defaults, that the default configuration file, that it's overwhelming if you're first starting out. So my kind of go-to are these three files here, or I'm sorry, these three kind of parameters, right? You have an inventory. You have inventory, which basically says where's your inventory at. So let's say I had a folder that had this inventory.yaml in it. You would just put the relative path, right? So I could put inventory, and then put a slash, and then inventory.yaml if the folder name was inventory. Forks is an interesting one. Forks is basically the number of the way I read it is, whenever I first had this configured, was the number of processes or parallel connections and devices your Ansible, or I'm sorry, not your, just Ansible will connect to. So let's say, like in our case, we're only connecting to 2 devices. So whenever the playbook runs, a task will be executed, and in this case, because forks is equal to 15, up to 15 devices will be touched at one time per task. By default, I believe forks is set to 5. So in our case, because we're running in a lab environment, 5 would be okay. But either way, I like to just explicitly say how many forks we have. And think of it, you might be like confused, like, okay, why is it called forks? So in the computer software sense, and within Linux, forking is basically creating a child processes and separate processes to do different calculations, right? So we're creating different forks to do this separate processing. Angel asks, is fork like workers in Linux? Yeah, that's kind of the way I like to describe it. Now, I'm sure a software engineer can come in here and tell me something different. But yeah, think of it like workers. Like if you ever use Nornir, now Nornir, it's different because they use threads, I believe, which is definitely different. But yeah, to put it in the simplest terms, yeah, think of it as like workers. And it's the number of workers per task, right? And we'll see, like you get multiple tasks per playbook. So let's say we have more than 15 devices, then we would have to wait for one of those processes to free up for it to hit the 16th, 17th, and so on. And then the last is the host key checking false. So that's just because I don't think anyone, and I don't say anyone, most people don't have any sort of signed certificates for their network devices. So, that prompt you get when you first connect to a network device, because it's, presenting a self-signed certificate, that's what that is. So it's basically saying, don't worry about checking the host keys on the local machine, on the control node, to make sure that, you have something in your known host file. Just accept it and move on. So that's kind of a default behavior, for network automation anyways. We always disable host key checking. So, and that's about it for the Ansible configuration file. All right, so now we have the configuration down. The next thing we got to look at is inventory, right? So actually, let's start with the simple first, and we'll kind of go down the line. So you remember I said that you could have 2 different groups of devices. You have all, and then we have ungrouped. So ungrouped, let's say we have groups defined called routers and switches. And if, let's say we had a device that wasn't in that. So let's say, for whatever reason, we have firewall 1, and we call it Ansible host, and we just said whatever. I'm going to delete it anyways, right? So let's say we had this, but it wasn't underneath of any specific group. Well, in that case, it would be by default in the ungrouped category. So that's what they mean by ungrouped. But in this case, what I like to do, and if you were to do this in production, I would suggest doing it a little differently, is I always put the variables and the groups under the all category. So you'll see like all : children. So in this case, what that says is, okay, there's the all category, but what belongs to all? Routers and switches. And these are group names, okay? And so let's say for whatever reason, our router devices had something more specific, like a different username password to get into them. You would go under routers, and then you would have another group name down here called routers vars. And just like you see here, and I kind of skipped over it, all vars basically means variables that apply to all devices, which by default is every device. But going with our example, let's say the routers for whatever reason had a different set of variables. Down here, you would say, like, for example, Ansible user, right? And instead of saying Dan, it was Cisco, right? So what routers would use is actually it would use this one here because it's more precise and down to the group level. But by default, all devices look at the variable group under under all. So I just don't want to get people confused with kind of what everything means. But just think of it this way: anything with a colon, whatever's before that is the group most of the time, and then whatever's after is it could be a host of things, but in our case, we're looking at just the variables. So this one's pretty easy. We have one group called routers, one group called switches. We have a device, this IP address, and as our router, which is our I won't go to it, but the EVE-NG environment. I have a router and a virtual router and a virtual switch online right now. So the Ansible host is a variable basically giving the IP address. You could just put the IP address underneath it here, but I wanted to add an alias, or what's called an alias, which is what you see here, R1 and SW1. And you see the bottom, this is actually a play I ran. I actually ran a playbook before the stream, and you see that R1 and SW1 are here in the play recap. And if I didn't use an alias, the IP addresses would be here, or the host names, or whatever I wanted to use. But in this case, because I don't have DNS set up with any of my devices, I created an alias, and I can reference that alias. I can reference that alias in all my playbooks, anywhere I reference this inventory file. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, so that's the INI inventory. So let's jump over to inventory.yaml. So as I mentioned, this is like one of the other popular ways to describe your inventory. Much different format-wise, but it still has all the same information. So you'll see here, everything is under all. And I think I mentioned it, indentation is key with anything YAML. So, you might see like, okay, it's nice that he made the spacing and it's more readable. It's like, no, I actually had to do this. Otherwise, you get errors thrown your way if you don't have the spacing right. And so I guess before I dive into it, the three dashes across the top indicate the start of a YAML file. You can actually put multiple YAML documents within one YAML file. So let's say I wanted to end this document. I would just put 3 dots. So the 3 dots mean, okay, end this file and start another document. Whereas the 3 dashes mean to start a document. So just wanted to mention that, just in case you see it, out in the wild. So we start out with all again, and we say, okay, well, within all, we have our variables, and you'll see Ansible Python interpreter, network OS, and I missed these in the INI file, but they're the same, and I'll just quickly go over them. The network OS is actually kind of important because it helps Ansible understand, well, what type of devices are we connecting to? Username, password, become method. These may be older, so I don't want to steer you wrong. You may want to do your homework on these, but I believe they're still active. basically what this means is to elevate your privileges. So by default, like when I log in, and I'm sure I'm logged out of this device by now. Let me see. Yeah, so when I log in, you know, I'm just in, I still have to get in privilege mode using enable. So if I do enable, then I get another password prompt, right? So what the become and the become method do is basically allow you to elevate yourself into that privilege mode. And so this is saying, yes, I want to get into that privilege mode using it. And then this says using enable, and then what the password is. So it's kind of like going down the prompts, like, yes, I want to do it, you know, use enable, and then here's the password. Luckily, you know, in our case, because it's our lab environment, we're using just, you know, BS passwords. So here we have our host under all. Within this host, we actually basically specify children. And the reason we specify children here is because we have different groups. So going back to like the INI, we have routers and switch group, right? So routers and switches, and then we have our list of hosts for each of those. So you like here, you'll see hosts highlighted 3 times. You're probably like, why are we repeating ourselves? You kind of have to drill in. Remember, I told you I said indentation was super key. You kind of have to drill in and say, okay, well, the children of all is routers and switches. And you can kind of see, it might be hard to see on stream, but there's actually a little faded line right here that lights up, and it shows what's in line with this word. So the only thing in line with it is the switches group. And then everything to the right is indented. So you'll see, you know, under routers, okay, we want to know our hosts. And to kind of explain the indentation a little bit more under the group, this is where I could put my vars as well, right? So going off the example of, let's say the routers had different login credentials, we could say vars, and then we would type in, you know, this isn't correct syntax, but you would say like, you know, username equals, or I guess I'll just use right syntax so that way you can follow along. But let's say, you know, username Ansible user Cisco, because Ansible user up here is at the global level. Think of it as like, you know, your global level, and then this one is more specific just to routers, but we won't be using that, you know, that. So you could put more than just host under these groups, but for our use case, we're just putting switch 1, router 1, and then the 2 host IPs. So that's the YAML format. I don't want to tell you what's best practice because I don't know for certain, but I've definitely seen YAML format done more in practice than the INI. The INI is definitely easy to start with. So I would highly suggest starting with INI just so you get an idea of like the relationships, because that's really all it is. Like this is tough. This can be tough to read if you're like, okay, why do we have this all at the top and then routers is down here? Like all I want to do is get to this. So like, why didn't I just put it at the top? There are better ways maybe to organize this, but at the end of the day, you know, INI is just easier to read versus that YAML. But once you get INI done, you can easily convert it to a YAML format. So just want to kind of put that out there, that's why I created both a simple inventory and then just inventory. So that way you can kind of see. So if there's any questions on that, please put it in the chat. I'd be glad to answer any questions you have. Well, it could be about anything we've gone over so far, or if there's any just use case questions. We actually had a really good use case in the last stream where we actually live used Scrapply to parse out some data that one of the viewers was, you know, trying to parse out on his own, actually for a work task. So we you know, I love doing those kind of live use cases. Okay, so we went over configuration, we went over inventory, so we're good there. Now it's time to break into the playbook. So if you've heard of Ansible, I'm sure you've heard of the what's called Ansible Playbook. And this is kind of where rubber meets the road. This is where the action happens. So we'll kind of start at the very top and go down. Like you can see here, it's a small, there's only 3 tasks. But we'll go over these 3 tasks, and then my goal is to actually create another playbook that pushes out configuration, right? So that way, by the end of this, you understand Ansible, you understand how to kind of set it up for the first time to a degree, and then how to write a playbook to view data, and then one to configure devices. And obviously, because this is the road to the DevNet Expert, there's going to be a little more to this than just what I'm doing right here on stream, but I don't want to make any assumptions and get people lost while on stream. So I will be studying this off stream as well, but I think it's easier and it's probably more entertaining if I start at the very beginning and kind of walk through it with everyone. So that way, if you have no idea and you just want to join the stream, you can learn something during the stream, versus if I just jump right into a playbook and start troubleshooting and all that, that's not really fun. It's not fun for me. It's not fun for the viewer, I imagine, as well. But if I find that you guys, girls, anyone watching the stream, want to dive deeper into any of these topics, like we looked at Scrapply last stream, and like the Ansible this stream, then I'll do another stream, kind of a part 2, and we'll dive deeper. So that way, you guys can understand like more advanced topics like roles, for example, which we won't touch on tonight, but there's this idea of roles that it allows you to, like I said, create those relationships, because that's really what Ansible is all about. Is it creates relationships amongst different groups, and then that has a lot of implications for what commands are ran, the playbooks that are run, what's ran in the playbooks. So, but we won't, like I said, we won't get into that tonight. Let me quickly go over, make sure I'm not getting ahead of myself. So, yeah, we talked about inventory basics. And you can see here, like, there's a ton. Look at this. Like, really look at this. The amount of nesting that this inventory file is doing, right? So you take this and you're like, oh my, like you could read it left to right and be like, okay, so under all, there's the US, and then under the US, there's the Southeast, and then under Southeast, there's Atlanta and Raleigh. Oops, and Raleigh. And you're like, okay. I mean, it's kind of crazy, right? Well, or you can look at the INI version, which, like I said, if you're just starting out, I encourage you to create your inventory file to look like this first, for you to get a better understanding of kind of how it is. Otherwise, if you start with YAML, I will bet money. I won't say an amount, but I will bet money that you'll have issues with indentation. You'll get an error right away, that you'll have a ton of indentation errors, and it will be a space here, a space there. It'll get so annoying. So before you dive into this, and trust me, there's linters and formatters to help you out with the spacing and the indentation in like VS Code, but just if you're starting out, please just do INI. Then there's always room to jump into YAML. So, and trust me, there's a lot of YAML to go around when it comes to network automation. So, all right, enough of that. So we have that, basic concepts. Let's see, where's... All right, so we'll start at the top, because I haven't really had hands-on keyboard yet. So, installing Ansible, we already installed it using the methods here, and then confirm that your Ansible says must be greater than 2.5, but I know it is because I just installed it. So I'll clear it down here for the terminal. Ansible tac version. So this actually gives you a lot of good information. So it'll tell you what version of Ansible you're running. Like I said, I don't have the .26, that like patch number, or that micro edition, I guess you could call it. But 2.9, the config file. What's really neat about this here is, so it tells you exactly where the config file is, which, it's in the same directory, so it's easy to find. But check this out. If we go up a level and I do the same command, look, config file, none. So you could tell it dynamically looks for that config file, and the documentation will tell you where it looks for it. But off the top of my head, I can tell you it's the Etsy, the root Etsy Ansible location, or within your current directory. So if we switch back, we'll do a quick clear. Clear, and then we'll do Ansible version. So I switched back to the Ansible folder again, and sure enough, it found it. So very important that the config file is within the directory that you're looking at, or looking to execute your playbooks. So tells you your configured search path, your module location. This kind of gets important if you download modules. So like there's a kind of a, I don't want to call it third party, but there's another library you can download modules called Ansible Galaxy. And so it allows you to download kind of these different modules. And so this may be good if you want to save those modules, is to understand where your current modules are located, your execution environment, and then the Python version. Quick question here. Blues Kernel says, hi Dan, how do you make Ansible run in Python 3.9? You should be able to, so the way I did this, and I did skip over this, I apologize. So like if I do Python 3 -- version, you see I'm running 3.8.10. So if you have Python 3.9 installed and you did this command, you would see Python 3.9.7, I think is the most stable. So assuming you have Python installed, do Python 3. I use venv for my virtual environment always. And by the way, if you're using Python to install Ansible, I highly recommend using a Python virtual environment. If you're unsure what that is, look it up. You can either use venv or virtual env. Look up either of these Python modules, and I highly recommend using them. But in my case, I did Python -m venv, and then I created a virtual environment, which in my case called venv Ansible, right? So once I got into that virtual environment, I did a source, and then went into the and I'm typing out all the commands for you, by the way. If you're unfamiliar with virtual environments, it'll probably look Greek to you. But essentially what this does is activate the virtual environment. So I'm using the source command, source, the name of your virtual environment, /bin/activate. And then once you have it activated, once the virtual environment's activated, you should see it in your terminal, the name of the virtual environment in parentheses. And you'll know you're in it if you do a pip list. And when you do that, now this is going to pop up with some stuff. But when you do that, this should be empty, or it might have like 1 or 2 packages for pip. But then after that, all you do once you're in your virtual environment, you do pip install Ansible. And in our case, I should say this: pip install Ansible will install the latest version of Ansible. And for those unaware, Ansible got real weird with their numbering and their versioning, so I don't really want to explain it because I don't even get it. But because for the expert exam, we'll be using 2.9. You have to use the double equal sign 2.9. So what that does is specify a specific version when you look at when it looks at PyPy, which is the software repository for Python. So pip install and then Ansible equals 2.9. And after you run that, you should be good. Hopefully that answers your question. I will say one weird thing I had to do was install Paramiko separately. And I don't know why, but Paramiko, by the way, is an SSH library used to connect to the network devices, so it's crucial, but I don't know why it wasn't installed alongside Ansible. So, and then after you run pip install Ansible, pip install Paramiko, you should have pretty much what I have here. When you run pip list, you should have all these packages. Obviously, Ansible will be the most important, but Paramiko, Jinja 2 is used for some of the conditional statements and like the logic within your playbooks. So, yeah. So, Blue's kernel, yeah, I hope. All right, cool. He said, sure, thanks. Yeah, and if anyone has questions like what kind of Blues brought up there, feel free to ask it. You know, if I go over something, I totally missed going over how to install Ansible. But yeah, if you have any questions after the stream, or if you're watching this on demand, you know, feel free to message me. There's a chance I may point you at the documentation or like a specific part of the documentation, but their documentation is pretty good, and there's multiple ways to install it. So, all right. Let's see. Where was I? Oh, so going over the playbook. Let's see. Let me take that out. Okay, so there's a few ways we can actually run our Ansible. You can run Ansible modules, or run Ansible modules. You can run Ansible ad hoc or using a playbook, right? So think of it as, you know, you can run Python code. You can run it as, you can run the individual modules. And that actually is a good example because I was showing you guys how to create a virtual environment, and I was using Python-M and then venv. So this actually is saying Python 3 -M stands for what module within Python. I'm using the venv module, and then I was naming the virtual environment, which I think I named it venv-Ansible. So yeah. So anyways, so that would be like a good example for ad hoc. Trenchman says, I usually pip freeze to list installed packages. What is the difference between pip freeze and pip list? So good question. So pip list is just a, it literally is pip freeze, but just in your terminal. So this is just your standard output. So what pip freeze does is literally take this pip list here and turn it into a text file. Or it takes this data, formats it, and then outputs it to a text file. And so just so everyone kind of is on the same page, so if I do pip freeze, and then let's just call it output.txt. Normally you would call this like requirements.txt, but what I'll do is just do output. And let's just do it here. So you'll see pip freeze. All right, so it's done, and you see output.txt. So if you look at pip list and pip freeze, it's literally the same thing. So yeah, it's pip freeze you only really need to do whenever you're saving or creating like a requirements text file, whereas pip list is like, in my case, like if let's say my Ansible Playbook didn't run or something, like when I did Ansible -- version, I wouldn't do a pip freeze and read off this text file. I would just do pip list to see what the current version is. So hopefully that answers your question. Just delete this output real quick. Hey Randy, how's it going? Sensei Danny. Okay. Where was I? Man, really good questions though. I appreciate. Don't worry if I get thrown off. I appreciate the questions, and I love answering the questions. So keep them coming. All right. Playbook. We'll go over Playbook here. So I'm not going to get into running the ad hoc commands because, to be honest, besides like you running your very first like Ansible command, like the ping module, for example, you can use the Ansible ping module to like ping your device, and if it has a positive, if it replies, it will reply with pong, so ping pong. It's supposed to be funny, but yeah, I mean, I don't really use the ad hoc commands, so I'm not going to go over them. But if you're interested, and like I said, if you're just starting out, I would recommend just at least taking a look, right? But yeah, you can see like this is running the first command, and then now we get into creating and running our first playbook. So before I jump into it, let me just make sure there's no other questions. Trenchman says, okay, cool. Pip freeze with no file output. Also just list in your terminal. Yep, spot on. You are spot on. That's exactly what it does. So, all right, creating your first playbook. So it's actually cool. They created like a very simple one here where it just gets configuration and then displays the config. So what I'll do probably is we'll do this, but then create like an iOS version of it, right? And so that way you guys can have a better understanding. And actually, it may work better if we, I know I can download the file, but I'm not doing that. So we'll just say git iOS facts.yaml, paste, and let's just steal the beginning of this, and we'll steal this just because I know the formatting's right. And the only reason I'm stealing this, by the way, like from my other playbooks, is because I know the indentation's right. Eric says, hi Dan, I used the pip freeze pipe grep package name double arrow or greater than sign requirements txt. I don't like to include the install package dependencies. In my opinion, I think it keeps the list small and cleaner. Interesting. Okay, so you're saying you do a pip freeze only the package name, and then the double arrow, if I'm remembering correctly, it appends to your requirements file. So if you do now fire pip freeze requirements, right? So if you do just the single arrow, that will write a file. Like if requirements txt exists, it will delete everything in the file and create requirements like txt, like brand new with whatever's in the pip list. But what Eric's saying is he does pip freeze grep and then the name of the package. So in our case, let's say Ansible, and then a double arrow. Okay. So if I'm reading this right, is he basically says, okay, I don't care about the dependencies that come with it. So he will, for each individual package, he'll freeze the dependencies, like whatever's in the environment, right? Whatever's installed, grep on the package name. So in our case, we're using Ansible, and then he'll just add it into the requirements file. That's interesting. Because when you do pip list, and I kind of get what Eric's saying here. So when you do pip list, I know these four, yeah, I think these four, actually everything but pip and package resources, and 6 and setup tools. Okay, so PyYAML, Jinja 2, markup safe, cryptography, cryptography, holy, it's been a day. These are all dependencies of Ansible. So what Ansible does is look to see if they're installed in your current environment, and if they're not, they'll install these individual dependencies. But what Eric is saying is, I don't really care to know about the dependencies. All I care is I want Ansible, and I'll include that in its version in my requirements.txt. Will it have some issues? It could, down the line, it could, because if there's a dependency conflict between two packages, how does it get resolved? But like in our case, if we just did requirements txt and the only thing in our requirements was Ansible equals 2.9, it would look for all of these packages, and if they weren't there, it would install them. So I get what you're saying though with it being cleaner and a smaller list, because it definitely would be a smaller list, definitely. But I can only see it. I think it would only go. I don't think it would scale too far beyond like only a few packages, because then, like I said, you don't want to hit a dependency conflict where, let's say, I know for a fact, like until recently, PyATS, for example, required Jinja 2 to be less than the 3.0, because Jinja 2 version 3.0 just came out. Actually, it didn't just come out, but it's newer. But for some reason, PyATS wouldn't support it, so you had to run Jinja 2 version 2.11. So like if I tried installing that alongside Ansible, there might be a little conflict. And so, but anyways, I digress. But very cool. I had never thought about that. That's actually kind of a pretty, it is definitely a way to make a smaller requirements text file. Okay. So let's do this. Let's go over. Let's quickly go over this playbook, and then we'll create that playbook. We'll finish creating that playbook, right? Because I did say I want to go over a playbook and then create one. So in this one, this is one I already created before the stream, and I ran it, and we'll run it again here. So what this does is I always call it like a you kind of have you have like I call it like a preamble. Like you have like your the name of the playbook, the host within your inventory file that you are affecting, whether you want to gather facts on your devices. So gathering facts is like a way of Ansible picking and prodding to figure out facts, literal facts about your device. So I'm trying to think of a good analogy. I don't want to say it's like SNMP, because it's not, where like it pulls individual. But like, for example, all the information that you find in like a show version, like your serial number, OS, maybe number of switches in a stack, all that stuff is like facts that Ansible would gather, right? But within this, like it just depends on the device. Like for example, iOS, I know it grabs the version, it grabs the model number, it grabs the configuration, like the show run. So there's a few different things, but you get my point though. But I'm setting that to false because I don't really need it, because I don't want to, that also adds overhead, like if you have it enabled, so I'm not going to do it. The connection type is network CLI. And so let me see, I think I have this up still. Oh. Network CLI. It might be in the very basic concepts still. Let me find it. Here we go. Perfect. So Ansible has this concept of communication, the way it communicates with your device, right? So, it has, this used to be called, you used to use just the local connection. So up until now, like it's kind of dating myself, because like it's been around for a while, the network _ CLI, but I think it was like 2.5. We're at 2.9. Well, we're beyond that now, but you get my point. So we used to just have to use the local connection type, because that would just use just the local, basically whatever we had configured for the specific device. Whereas now we actually have a communication type called network CLI. But you can see here, like it supports netconf, which is XML over SSH, and it also supports HTTP APIs. That's a mouthful. But that's pretty neat, because now with network devices having APIs and software-defined controllers, you can use these different sort of Ansible connections to connect to different devices. In our case, we're just using the network CLI because we're using virtual iOS devices. But man, they really did a good job with some of this documentation, because I remember it was tough to find some of these answers before. At least maybe I was looking in the wrong place, but I knew I needed an Ansible connection, and I always just did local because that's what I saw online, what I saw on the examples. Oh, okay, yeah. So Ansible 2.6 is where they start recommending to use something else besides local. So, modules. So this kind of explains the naming prefix for everything. Pretty straightforward. iOS underscore. I actually know some of the, if you take the Cisco exams, the DevNet exams, some of the associate, I believe, definitely the professional level and the specialist ones, you have to know a little bit about Ansible. And so you kind of remember the popular modules. So iOS underscore command, iOS underscore config, iOS underscore fax. Those are some ones we'll look at tonight. And then all the other providers or manufacturers have their own modules as well. Oh, here's about privilege escalation. You can use the become word key, I'll call it, to connect to devices and gets into a privilege escalation. It used to be authorized, and man, that sucks. I just lost my spot. Oh, there it is. So it used to be authorized. I used to use authorize back in the day, but now use become. So this is a good page. I actually let me see. I'm gonna throw this in the chat for you guys. Let me figure out here. There we go. Cool. All right. So that's in the chat for everyone. You can come to this page. Is the only reason I put that specific page is because it's super informative. This is a lot of stuff that I had to find on many pages of Googling. So highly recommend taking a look here. But anyways, what I wanted to get to was to talk about running the playbook and then the actual network modules. And I'll put this in the chat as well. All right. So those are the two important pages that if you want to take anything from the stream, those two pages, I highly recommend read them over, take a look at them. They pretty much have everything you need. So you'll see, we're kind of jumping around, but we had a playbook, we had tasks defined in the playbook. And so in this case, we have 3 tasks. And the tasks because they have a little dash, and that basically represents each individual task. A task has a name, so this can be arbitrary. So here, viewing software version doesn't really view the actual software version. It just runs a show version. But you see here, I'm using the iOS command, and the commands that we're using we're using one, but you can use multiple. So you can have a list of commands, if you want to run show version, show environment, show CPU processes, or show processes CPU, you could do that. The register keyword actually stores that output as a variable, and what you can then call on later. So, and you can do things with the variable. So just like you would in programming, you can manipulate it. And then the last little bit is the when keyword. So when is kind of interesting because think of it as an if statement. Like, and it looks weird because it's always placed at the end of a task, but read it this way. This is the way I kind of taught myself is, if you ever see, like, yeah, it's good to start with the name, but maybe start at the bottom and say, okay, well, start from the bottom and go up. So you see when, and then think of it as an if statement. So if the Ansible Network OS equals iOS. So this is actually, like, think of it as a reserved variable for Ansible. And I'm sure I'm not going to check now, but I'm sure there's a reserved variable list that will tell you all the different types of variables. But Ansible _network _OS basically is like a reserve variable for the different, the operating system that's collected from the device. So in our case, it will go out and say, okay, well, the operating system is an iOS device. Then we are going to run show version, and we're going to store it under a variable called versions. Okay. And like the second task is basically the same thing, except what we're doing is viewing the configured syslog servers. So we actually do a show run pipe pipe include logging host, just like you would on the CLI. And then we'll register that variable as syslog servers. That's the variable name. And then we'll use the when clause again to say, okay, if Ansible Network OS equals iOS. So it's only for iOS devices. So like if we had a Juniper device or an ASA in our inventory, these tasks would not run against them. And then the last little bit is just to print out. I only picked one, but we print out the syslog servers variable. So the output of whatever it finds for this command on both of our devices. So I'll show you how to run it. Ansible Playbook. TAC I or -I stands for the inventory file we want to use. So by default, if you look in our configuration file, it's telling you where to look for our inventory, but I always like to put just the inventory within the command. So we'll do inventory, and we'll run it against both inventory. They're the same inventory file, the simple one with the INI format, and then the more complex one, the YAML format. But we'll do the YAML format first. So we'll do inventory, and then actually, I did not put the name of the Ansible playbook. It's called show version.yaml. And so we're going to run the playbook against that inventory, and let's run it against, because I don't think you can actually specify, the host. So within the playbook, you can say what host you want to run it against. So right now I'm going to do, let's just do routers. We only have one router device, but just to show you the flexibility, because if you remember in our inventory file, and I'll just reference this one because it's easier to read, we have a group named routers, and we have one host named R1, okay? So within our playbook, we're going to say we're just running against the routers. All right, and I'm trying to think if there's anything else I got to tell you. Let's try it. Okay, so you can see the play took off. Gather network device information, that's the name of the playbook. The task, view software version. The first one is okay, done. View configured syslog servers. Where was I? Right here. This task, show run pipe include logging host. Done. Okay. And the green, when it says okay, obviously it means successful, but it also, and you'll see whenever we try to configure something, it also means that we're not, we didn't change anything on the device, right? We left it as it is. And Ansible is item potent, which basically means it will run the task once, and if it tries running it again, you should expect the same result. And it won't redo the task, right? It'll recognize that the task was completed. So, show run, pipe include, logging hosts, syslog servers, Ansible Network OS. Okay, the last one. Sorry, I lost my place there. Printing out configured syslog hosts. So you'll see here, there's a little more to dive into, and I'll actually expand here. So you'll see R1, it outputs the syslog servers variable, which is, as I said before at the very beginning of the stream, that Ansible is built on Python. So all this is Python at the end of the day. But you'll see syslog servers, it's basically a dictionary, right? And you'll see that there's some values in there: changed, failed, std out, and std out lines. What that stands for is standard output, and then standard output lines. So you'll see here standard output and standard output lines. And so I don't have a good example because it only captured one line, but if it captured more, I'm sure we'd see more, but I only have one logging host on the router. So what I did was to print all of this. This isn't by default, which, because like you see here, like I was able to do the show run and captured the output, but the way I was able to print it out to my terminal was using this debug var. So the debug module basically allows you to think of it as like a print statement, right, or a logging in your Python script. But in this case, it's like a print statement, and you could debug, and you could use either var, which obviously stands for variable, or you can use another input called message, or I think MSG for short, and you literally could just put like just to explain a little bit, you literally can say hello. And so there would be a message that would just say hello, right? But obviously we wanted to look at what the variable had in store. So, but let's say we wanted just to get this output here, the standard output lines, because it is a dictionary. You literally can use the dot notation to access standard output lines. And let's just run it again. Hopefully, hopefully the demo gods are looking over us. No, I was pretty confident with that one. So you can see here, it actually printed out, it got into this specific part of the dictionary and only printed out the standard output lines, right? So if you wanted to use this value, you could actually take this value and you could parse it out even further if you wanted to. But obviously we only captured this one specific logging host line. So I'll kind of leave it at that. So we'll keep that there. So that's it for I call it show version. Realistically, what I probably should do is I'll take out this command. I'm sorry, this task. I'll keep it to 2 task, and I'll just call it like show logging, because I want to keep these specific to like a specific task. So that way someone that reads it can see it as is and not have to question like, why did he put this task? So we'll call it what the heck? We'll call it gather syslog information. And we'll just do all hosts this time. So I just did routers last time. So what I'm going to actually collect all hosts this time. So this will be routers and switches. So in our case, besides R1, you should also see SW1 or switch 1. So I purposely made it look like this because the router is the only one with the logging host command configured, whereas switch 1 doesn't have anything. And just to prove to you, enable Cisco show, what's it, logging, or no, show run pipe logging. Yeah, so logging host 10.1.1, which you can see is for router 1. And then if you log into this one, show run logging, we won't have anything. Yeah. Well, no logging console. Oh, because we did pipe to logging host. So that's why it didn't pop up, because there's no logging host. See? So makes sense why there's no output for that. But pretty neat stuff, I think. All right, so we'll rename this one show logging instead of show version. And all right, so let's do a couple things with this one, right? Gather facts and we'll gather facts and then we'll configure SNMP. And this is what this will kind of be like the grand finale. So we'll create one task that will gather facts, and then we'll create another task. See what I mean? My spacing gets all messed up if I try copy and pasting elsewhere. And I'll actually display, I actually will use this, I'll steal this one here. This last little bit from the example found on what am I trying to say? Come on, Dan. On the Ansible website. Sorry, I was like trying to like type and talk. Okay. So here we go. So we're gonna do a couple things here. Display the device facts. We'll actually be a little more verbose and software version. All right, so what we're gonna do with this one, and I'll minimize the terminal a little bit. So we'll have 3 tasks. We'll have one that will gather all the facts about the device, and then we'll print out just the host name and the operating system. Okay. And then what we'll do is we will configure the SNMP. Yeah, we'll configure SNMP. SNMP settings. All right, so let's do this. We'll cut that out. We'll literally start fresh with both, besides the second task, okay? So iOS facts. So as I mentioned, I know for a fact that, well, everything begins with iOS, right? So we're gonna do iOS, of course. I was trying to be cool about it, but of course, FortiOS or whatever it is has iOS in it, so I can't do that. iOS, here we go. So surprisingly, there's not as many modules as you'd expect, but you know, we'll kind of work with what we have. So there's one called iOS Facts, okay? And whenever you're doing this yourself, you want to make sure that you're looking at either, you know, the right version, right? So we know we're running an older version of Ansible 2.9 versus the latest, which I think they numbered it like 4, but it's not actually numbered 4. Like I said, I'm not going to get into the versioning. So iOS Facts will tell you like some parameters that you could feed into it. And the only one we're really going to mess with is gather subset. So in this case, you'll see that when supplied, this argument restricts the facts collected to a given subset. Possible values include all minimum hardware configure interfaces. The default is basically to collect everything but the configuration. So that exclamation point means what not to collect. Okay, and these are all considered subsets. So I think I may keep it, well, no, I don't want to keep it default. I'll do all just to kind of show you what it looks like. So the way you would do this, right, because these are parameters. So we'll do gather subset, and that's about it. The rest of them you could read through, but here's a perfect example of how it will look. You specify the module, and then you literally just put in the parameters. And in our case, this is exactly what we want. So I'm just going to take it. And of course, like I said, the indentation was messed up, but we're done. So now, and I'll do the verbose version. So like when you run an Ansible Playbook, you actually can do a dash and then add V's, the letter V, to get more verbose output. And what that basically means is it allows for more debugging, right? So we're gonna gather iOS facts, and what's next? Display the device host name. So let's quickly do this. I'm just gonna comment this out so that way you guys can see, because we're gonna run this, and I just want to do we'll call this is get iOS facts, get iOS facts inventory, and we'll do 1v. 1v basically is like level 1 of being verbose. It won't print out as much. You could do, I think, up to like 4 V's, and that will be like, it will tell you every little thing about this. So you're probably like, holy crap, what is all that? Like, you're like, oh my gosh. So I'll give you a little warning actually with the default values. Like, it looks like it's going to change soon, but, or I'm sorry, it was changed from min to not include config. And you can see why, because, and I'll just get all this output here. So you can see R1 spits out Ansible facts and all this stuff. And then switch 1 right there spits out all these facts. So what I'm going to do, just to like, I think it's easier to see whenever it's like formatted, right? So I'm going to grab, because this grabbed information, facts from the router and the switch. So what I'm going to do is JSON. Oops. Did this format it? No. No. JSON. Format. So quick little trick with that. Down here in the bottom right of VS Code, if you choose the language and then highlight everything and right click, you can do format document, and it will make it nice and pretty. So but anyways, so I think I mentioned earlier about the kind of the reserved variables, and you kind of see what I mean. That might not be the right word, so don't take it, don't take my advice with it, but that's kind of what I refer to them as. But you have Ansible facts, you have a list of all the IPv4 interfaces configured on the device. So I have a list of, actually have some sub interfaces configured, which is why you see these extra variable or IP addresses. It tells you the net API, the net config. So this one's interesting because this is a key, like key value pair, just like you'd find in like a Python dictionary. But the key is Ansible net config, and then the value is one big string of the entire show run config. Luckily, this running config isn't that big because there's not much on this device, but that's crazy. You literally can pull that. And then like, think about it. If you took it into a Python program and said, okay, we'll split on the new line character, you see how many there are within this file. You literally could reproduce the running config. All right, I'm not going to go through, but you can see like it tells you the amount of free space left on the flash, and then it tells you the specifics about each interface on the device. All right, this is the stuff that we want to find out. So Ansible net iOS type and Ansible net version. And, well, no, it was Ansible net version. What was in our playbook? What was here, let's see. So we're looking for Ansible net hostname, and these double curly braces identify a variable. So we have Ansible net hostname and Ansible net version, okay? So if we go back here, Ansible net hostname, I think it's before interfaces. Yeah, Ansible net hostname is just R1, which that's true, and then Ansible net version is 15.6.1t, okay? And so I haven't looked at the output yet, but this should print. This message should say the hostname is R1 and the OS is 15.6, whatever I just said. Sure enough, there you go. Hostname is R1, and then it even did it for the switch. Stream-SW and the OS is 15.2, and then because it's the VIOS, the iOS V image, then it has all those crazy numbers behind it. Pretty neat stuff, right? So we have the facts. And by the way, you know, I didn't really like mention this, but you literally can parse out any of these variables. So like, I know in our case, we just wanted the host name and the version, but like, let's say you wanted to create an if statement. So remember that when keyword, you could say, well, when the net version is, you know, well, that wouldn't work because it's a string. I'm trying to think of a really good, I mean, you could even do something like when there's less than a certain amount of free space on your flash, you know, print out a message that says, hey, you have low memory, right? Like that's a really like small example and probably might not be too relevant, but like you can parse out all those Ansible, like those facts are all provided because of these 3 lines of YAML code, right? So I think that's pretty impressive, especially if you're not familiar with Python or coding, right? So just wanted to kind of point that out. Let's see. All right, so we have the facts. We printed out a nice little message. All right, let's wrap it up with configuring something, okay? So once again, I know this is, let's see. Sorry, I just got an alert about the stream having some poor quality, so please let me know if you're having any sort of issues, or you know, can't see, or the audio is kind of messed up. But, all right, so we already have iOS facts. So the last piece here are your, there's a few ways you can manage like individual interfaces, and I'm not going to go through all these, but I do want to do this one here, iOS config, and I actually already had that up. So you see here, iOS configuration is you can use a simple block indent file syntax for segmenting configuration into sections. So basically, you put in exactly what you would in the SSH session, okay? And so, let's see, just to give an example, right? Angel, cool, thanks Angel, I see it. Okay, you said everything is good on YouTube. Okay, cool, I appreciate that. Stream is fine on YouTube. All right, cool. Well, that's the only platform I'm streaming on. It's just weird. I got thrown a weird error message, so I appreciate it. You know, everyone kind of chiming in. So with iOS config, you can actually specify the number of lines, the configuration under this lines item. Okay, and one thing to point out, and this is kind of where I say, remember to start with the bottom sometimes and read from the bottom up. So this is a good example, right? When you configure an interface configuration, like a description or IP address under an interface, you always have to put in the interface name first. And after that, then you're in the interface config, and then you put in like the description IP, right? So with Ansible, you have to identify what's called a parent. And so once you put in the parent, which technically is like the interface, then you can put in your lines. But the weird part is you have to put parents in after lines, okay? And like this one even gets weirder, right? So here's a perfect example. You're trying to configure IP helper addresses under, like, let's say, I mean, these have Ethernet interfaces, but like a common one are like SVIs, your switch virtual interfaces. And you want to do a lot of them. You don't want to just, like, let's say you have interface, VLAN 100 through 105, okay? Instead of writing 5 different tasks, you can actually create a loop using the with items key, and then you would put each individual SVI, and then you would just use the item keyword, which basically says, okay, well, when you loop, this item variable is dynamically changed depending on where you are in the loop, okay? So obviously item would equal interface Ethernet 1 first, it would loop through interface Ethernet 2, and so on. And then underneath of each of those interfaces, it would plug in these lines of configuration. So it's very confusing. I know, like, it took me a while to fully understand that, and like the fact I had to start from the, like, read from the bottom up really confused me. The only other thing I wanted to point out was this one here is loading a new ACL. So like if you've ever done any sort of maintenance work, you know that like you can't just edit an ACL. I mean, you can, I'm sorry, but there's a good chance that there may be times that you have to remove the ACL and then re-add it with new rules or, that extra line that needs to be put in. Instead of using, like, let's say the sequence number, let's say you didn't have a sequence number, whatever the case, you have to remove the ACL and then re-add it. Well, to do that, you have to use the before key to say, okay, before I do any of this, remove the ACL with the no command, and then use, jump into the ACL with the parent key, and then put in all your ACEs or your entries, right? And then you have to make sure it matches exactly. So there's a lot of good examples here, plenty more than what I'm used to in the past. You can use Jinja 2 templates. That's a really good example, actually. So anyways, point I'm getting to is there's a lot of different ways you can use this module, and it would solve a lot of use cases. The only problem sometimes with these, using Ansible and just kind of pushing the configuration out is the pre and post checks done afterwards. So like, there's not really a dry run, at least a feature that I'm aware of, like a dry run feature where you can say, okay, how's this going to look, and will it work after I configure the device, or should I say before the device is configured, how's the network going to react to it? And that's where you're like your testing and your lab networks and other open source libraries like Batfish and PyTS, SuzyQ, all these different libraries come into play. So Ansible fits in the life cycle, right? In the different, but it has its own place. So I just wanted to put that out there. Is a lot of people talk down Ansible. It is a very high level abstraction, but if you're just starting out, it is definitely a good way to introduce yourself to some of these concepts and an idea of, okay, what is configuration management, right? And how could I automate it and make sure it works, across the environment. So anyways, I digress from that. So what were we doing? I think we're just doing some SNMP. So we'll keep it simple. We'll just do the lines, okay? So in our case, we're not diving into any specifics. We're not diving into like under like an interface or an ACO, or have to go like into like a nested configuration, right? So what we're gonna do is just say, okay, well, we'll use the iOS config module, And this is not right. Hold on. There's that indentation again I told you about. Yeah, see? It's always indented this. Yeah, thought so. So like if I ran that with iOS config and lines under the same, section, it would throw an indentation error. So iOS config lines, and we're just doing a basic one. Let's do SNMP server. I think it's just location, right? Dan's lab. Keep it nice and bold. And just to prove to you that, we don't have any sort of configuration. All right, so sorry, I got an SNMP timeout config. I guess that I definitely came with the image. That was not something I put on there, but either way, it's not what we're configuring. We're just doing the SNMP location. I'll just do SNMP so that way you guys have an idea. Right, so you can see no SNMP config on either device. So we're just doing SNMP-server location, and normally this is obviously where you would put the actual physical location of the device, but in our case it's just a virtual device in my lab. So we'll just keep it as that, and we'll run the playbook again. I'm not going to do -v this time, just because I want to see, we're more concerned with the end. But we should still be able to see the hostname and the iOS version running. So it's gathering the facts. Yep, R1, the OS versions, that looks good. We're configuring SNMP settings so that it's actually connecting. And there we go. We're done. Just like that. So I mentioned this before, the OK, the green OKs basically say, okay, nothing was changed. Everything checked out. We were able to execute whatever task you wanted us to do, and we're done, right? But you'll notice here it says changed, right? So what it did was it went in and ran the task again, right? And it ran it, and it noticed that it changed configuration. So just to prove what it did, so we do the show run SNMP again, and there you go, SNMP server location Dan's -lab. And if we do it here, boom, there you go, SNMP server location. And that's just one small example. Now if we run it again, remember because Ansible is idempotent, we should see, well, let's say I don't want to ruin it. So it collected the facts. It was able to parse out the hostname and operating system again. And you can see. So, and that's why I didn't really want to say it. So the idempotency, or the idempotent part of Ansible is it recognized that it didn't have to configure anything, or it didn't, like, that configuration was already present on the device. So that's why you see the OKs in the configure SNMP settings task, right? Whereas it was this yellow saying that it changed, right? That is a huge feature. It's not just proprietary to Ansible, and it's not just specific to this platform. But idempotency and having an idempotent process is huge, because what that can tell you is, let's say we have just one switch and one router. Let's say you have a entire network of, like, I don't know, let's just say 500 routers, right? No switches, just 500 routers. And we wanted to configure that SNMP server. We wanted to configure SNMP v3, right? Which has a bunch more configuration than what we just pushed. If Ansible realizes that configuration already exists on the device and it didn't need to change anything, for that specific device, it'll say okay, and it's green. Whereas the devices that didn't have it configured or needed it configured, it would show up as changed and yellow. So that's kind of a big deal, especially when it comes to change control and pushing out a lot of changes, or I'm sorry, pushing out a massive change to a lot of devices. Idempotency is a big topic. So I just wanted to point that out. It's a very small little, like, to us, it's a nice little visual thing to say, oh, that's nice. It changed it during this run, but in this run, it was okay because it didn't have to change anything. So yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all I had for the stream tonight. If there's any questions in the chat, feel free to ask them now. I know the stream is, there's about a, I think like a 30 second delay maybe. So I'll give it a little bit for you guys to ask any questions. If not, I had a fun time. This is just brushing up on Ansible for me. There's going to be plenty of other things I have to look at for the DevNet Expert exam. But like I said, doing this and explaining it, I think helps me a lot in really solidifying the knowledge, knowing okay, I know the basics, I have a good feeling for it. And really, I do it because I really want to encourage people to jump into just network automation as a whole. So whether it be Ansible, Scrapply, anything else we look at in the future on the stream, I really just want to kind of drive some change and help out everyone. So I really hope you guys enjoyed the stream. If you have any questions with any of this, obviously all this code will be on the DevNet Expert GitHub the repository I started. I'll share a link to Twitter tonight, just as a reminder. But yeah, if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to message me on Twitter. That's probably the easiest way to get me. Other than that, I'll wait about another 30 seconds or so for if anyone has any comments about comments or questions. But other than that, I had a really fun time tonight. I'm really glad everything worked. I spent about a half hour before the stream getting everything prepped and making sure that basic stuff, reachability, Ansible, making sure Ansible is installed. I can run a basic script. So I'm really glad everything worked out, and because there's just so much that can go wrong, and as you guys know, everything can, especially during a demo, could crash. All right, so Angel says, I'm doing labs with my DevNet studies while you show everything. I'm not at that level, but it keeps me motivated. Angel, I appreciate that. I really appreciate that. I'm glad I can motivate you to kind of keep going. And everyone, we're all in our own journeys as far as speed and the way we progress and how fast we progress. The best thing I can tell you is be patient and stay disciplined. I mean, that's like what I live by is, you're never going to win the race if you're watching someone else. That's one of the, it's pretty easy to do, looking at someone else and like someone at the tip top of the industry, do their thing. But the reason they're doing their thing is because they're not looking around for other people to start the race for them, right? So just wherever you're at in DevNet, in your career, whatever, I think that's what the community is here for. So yeah, anytime you need, I think, honestly, anyone. I know you're involved with the Art of Network Engineering, the Discord and the community there. I mean, that's what got me started. So shout out to them with getting just everyone involved. And I know Eric was also involved with that Discord as well. So yeah, just keep a solid community around you and, kind of help each other through. So, all right. That's all I saw in the chat for kind of any closing questions or remarks. So as always, hit me up on Twitter if you have questions, and I will see you next Tuesday. Good night, everyone.
close till I get up. Time is barely on our side. I don't wanna waste what's left. The storms we chase are leading us, and love is all we'll ever trust.